At my college graduation ceremony, my professor, Ms. Davis, stood up during faculty speeches and announced that I was not smart enough for law school and should consider more realistic career options. I calmly walked to the podium and read my acceptance letter from Harvard Law School that had arrived that morning. Her face went completely white, and what happened next destroyed her credibility as an educator forever. Before I dive into this story of academic vindication and the most satisfying educational revenge imaginable, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever had teachers underestimate your potential or tell you to lower your academic goals, and subscribe to True Revenge for more stories of educational doubters being proven spectacularly wrong. My name is Sophia, I'm 22 years old, and until my graduation ceremony 3 weeks ago, I believed that teachers always had students' best interests at heart when they offered academic guidance. This story begins with a constitutional law class that nearly destroyed my confidence and ends with an acceptance letter that proved intelligence can't always be measured by one professor's standards. I attended Riverside University, a mid-tier state school known for solid academics but not necessarily for producing students who gain admission to elite graduate programs. Most graduates from Riverside go on to regional law schools, local master's programs, or enter the workforce directly after completing their undergraduate degrees. During my junior year, I enrolled in constitutional law with Professor Margaret Davis, a course that was required for my political science major and crucial preparation for the LSAT and law school applications. Professor Davis had been teaching at Riverside for over 20 years and had developed a reputation as a rigorous instructor who demanded high standards from her students. She was known for challenging coursework, detailed feedback, and what many students considered harsh but fair grading practices. I was excited to take constitutional law because I'd always been fascinated by legal theory and constitutional interpretation. I'd maintained a 3.8 GPA throughout college and had consistently performed well in political science courses, so I expected to succeed in Professor Davis's class. From the first week of the semester, it became clear that Professor Davis had very specific ideas about which students belonged in legal education and which ones should pursue alternative career paths. Law school is extremely competitive, Professor Davis announced during our initial class meeting. Most of you are not intellectually equipped for the rigors of legal education, and it would be irresponsible of me not to tell you that honestly. Constitutional law requires analytical thinking that goes beyond memorizing facts, she continued. Students who struggle with complex legal reasoning should consider whether law school is a realistic goal. Professor Davis's teaching style was intimidating and often seemed designed to discourage students rather than build their confidence in legal analysis. During class discussions, she would call on students randomly and critique their responses harshly, often suggesting that incorrect answers indicated fundamental intellectual limitations rather than simple misunderstandings. "That response shows you don't understand how constitutional interpretation works," she'd say when students struggled with complex concepts. Legal education requires precision of thought that not everyone possesses. "You're missing the analytical framework entirely," she'd tell students who offered alternative interpretations. This kind of confused thinking is why most people shouldn't pursue legal careers. Professor Davis's criticism was particularly focused on students like me who had expressed interest in attending top-tier law schools rather than local or regional programs. During office hours, when I mentioned my plans to apply to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford law schools, Professor Davis's response was immediately dismissive. "Sophia, you need to be realistic about your capabilities," she said, looking at me with what seemed like genuine concern. "Students from Riverside don't typically gain admission to elite law schools. Your performance in my class suggests you lack the analytical sophistication that top law schools expect," she continued. "You should focus on regional programs that are more appropriate for your academic level." Professor Davis's assessment of my analytical abilities was based on my performance on her exams and class participation, which she consistently rated as adequate but not exceptional. I was earning B+ grades in constitutional law, which was slightly below my usual academic performance but still respectable given the course's reputation for difficulty. But Professor Davis interpreted my B+ performance as evidence that I wasn't intellectually qualified for elite legal education. Top law schools accept students who demonstrate exceptional legal reasoning, she explained during one particularly discouraging office hours meeting. Your work shows competence, but not the brilliance that Harvard or Yale would expect. I'm trying to protect you from disappointment, Professor Davis added. Applying to schools where you have no realistic chance of admission is a waste of time and money. Professor Davis's constant discouragement began affecting my confidence about law school applications. Her professional authority as a legal educator made me question whether my academic goals were unrealistic. I started researching less competitive law schools and considering whether I should lower my expectations about where I might gain admission. But something about Professor Davis's assessment didn't feel entirely accurate. While I was struggling with her specific teaching style and exam format, I was performing well in other challenging courses and had received encouragement from different professors about my analytical abilities. My American government professor had written in my evaluation that I demonstrated exceptional critical thinking and sophisticated understanding of political theory. My international relations instructor had commented that my research papers showed graduate-level analytical sophistication and original thinking about complex policy issues. These positive assessments from other faculty members contradicted Professor Davis's evaluation of my intellectual capabilities. I decided to seek additional perspectives on my law school preparation by meeting with the pre-law advisor and taking practice LSATs to get objective measures of my readiness for legal education. The pre-law advisor's assessment was much more encouraging than Professor Davis's evaluation. Your grades and course selection show strong preparation for law school, the advisor told me during our meeting. Your writing samples demonstrate the kind of analytical thinking that law schools value. Don't let one professor's opinion discourage you from applying to reach schools, she continued. Admissions committees evaluate candidates holistically, and your overall academic record is very strong. The pre-law advisor's encouragement gave me confidence to continue pursuing applications to top-tier law schools despite Professor Davis's discouragement. I spent the summer between junior and senior year preparing intensively for the LSAT, taking practice tests and working with a tutor to improve my logical reasoning and analytical writing skills. When I took the official LSAT in October of my senior year, I scored 174 out of 180, a score that placed me in the 99th percentile of test takers and well within the range typically accepted by elite law schools. The LSAT score was validating because it provided objective evidence that my analytical reasoning abilities were much stronger than Professor Davis had suggested. Armed with a strong LSAT score and encouragement from the pre-law advisor, I submitted applications to Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, and NYU law schools, along with several backup options. The application process was grueling, requiring personal statements, letters of recommendation, and detailed essays about my academic and career goals. I asked Professor Davis for a letter of recommendation despite her previous discouragement, hoping that she might write positively about my improvement throughout the semester. Her response was predictably discouraging. Sophia, I don't think I can write the kind of letter that would help your applications to elite law schools, Professor Davis said when I requested her recommendation. My honest assessment would be that you're not intellectually prepared for the kind of rigorous legal education that top schools provide, she continued. I'd be happy to write a letter supporting your applications to regional law schools where your academic preparation would be more appropriate, she offered. Professor Davis's refusal to write a strong recommendation letter for top schools was disappointing but not entirely surprising given her previous comments about my capabilities. I secured letters of recommendation from other professors who were more supportive of my academic goals and more confident in my potential for success in legal education. Throughout my senior year, Professor Davis continued making comments about my unrealistic expectations and the importance of having backup plans for students who weren't admitted to their reach schools. Sophia, I hope you've applied to some safety schools, she'd say when she saw me in the hallway. The law school admissions process can be humbling for students who overestimate their qualifications. Most students from Riverside end up at regional law schools, and there's nothing wrong with that, she'd add. It's better to be realistic about your academic level than to be disappointed by rejections from schools that were never realistic options. Professor Davis's constant reminders about my supposed limitations were frustrating, especially as I was receiving more encouraging feedback from other faculty members and professional contacts. Law school admissions decisions typically arrive between February and May of senior year, creating months of anxiety for applicants waiting to learn about their academic futures. I checked my email constantly throughout the spring semester, hoping for positive news but also bracing myself for potential disappointments. The first response came from NYU Law School in early March, a waitlist decision that was neither acceptance nor rejection but left me in limbo about that particular option. Columbia Law School sent a rejection letter in mid-March, which was disappointing but not entirely unexpected given the competitiveness of the admissions process. By early April, I still hadn't heard from Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, and I was beginning to worry that Professor Davis's predictions about my qualifications might have been accurate. The waiting period was particularly stressful because my graduation ceremony was approaching, and Professor Davis had been selected to give one of the faculty speeches at the event. I knew that she would likely use her speaking opportunity to offer general advice about realistic goal setting and appropriate career expectations for Riverside graduates. Given her previous comments about my law school applications, I suspected that Professor Davis might use her graduation speech to reinforce messages about the importance of realistic expectations and appropriate academic humility. 3 days before graduation, I was checking my email before breakfast when I saw a message from Harvard Law School with the subject line, "Admissions Decision." My heart was racing as I opened the email, expecting either acceptance or rejection but hoping desperately for positive news. "Dear Sophia," the email began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been admitted to Harvard Law School for the fall semester." I had to read the acceptance email 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. Harvard Law School, one of the most prestigious legal education programs in the world, had accepted me despite Professor Davis's assessments of my intellectual limitations. The acceptance email continued with details about enrollment procedures, financial aid, and next steps for admitted students. But the most meaningful part of the message was the final paragraph. "Your application demonstrated exceptional analytical ability and academic promise. We look forward to welcoming you to Harvard Law School." The language about exceptional analytical ability was particularly validating given Professor Davis's contrary assessment of my intellectual capabilities. I printed out the acceptance letter and put it in my purse, unsure whether I would share the news immediately or wait until after graduation to announce my Harvard admission. Graduation day arrived with perfect weather and an atmosphere of celebration as 400 students prepared to receive their diplomas and transition to the next phase of their lives. My parents had driven in from out of state to attend the ceremony, and they were excited to celebrate my completion of undergraduate education and the beginning of my legal studies. The graduation ceremony followed traditional academic formats with processional music, faculty speeches, and individual recognition of graduating students. Professor Davis was introduced as the faculty speaker after the dean's welcome remarks. She approached the podium confidently, apparently prepared to share wisdom about post-graduation planning and career development. "Today we celebrate the achievements of Riverside University's graduating class," Professor Davis began, her voice carrying clearly through the outdoor amphitheater. "As you transition from undergraduate education to your careers and graduate studies, I want to share some thoughts about realistic goal setting and appropriate expectations," she continued. I had a sinking feeling about where Professor Davis's speech was headed, especially given her previous comments about students who overestimated their qualifications. Some students develop unrealistic expectations about their academic abilities and pursue goals that are beyond their intellectual capabilities, Professor Davis declared, looking directly at me in the audience. The 400 graduation attendees were listening politely, assuming Professor Davis was offering general advice about post-graduation planning. "It's important for students to understand their limitations and pursue opportunities that match their actual qualifications rather than their aspirational goals," she continued. Professor Davis's speech was clearly building toward a more specific message about academic humility and realistic career planning. For example, some students in my constitutional law class expressed interest in attending elite law schools despite lacking the analytical sophistication that such programs require, Professor Davis announced. My face burned with humiliation as I realized Professor Davis was using her graduation speech to publicly critique my law school applications. These students are not smart enough for law school at institutions like Harvard or Yale, Professor Davis declared. They should consider more realistic career options that better match their intellectual abilities. The amphitheater fell silent as 400 people processed the unusual turn that the faculty speech had taken. Students who pursue academic goals beyond their capabilities often face disappointment and failure, Professor Davis concluded. It's kinder to be honest about limitations than to encourage unrealistic dreams. Professor Davis stepped away from the podium, apparently satisfied that she had delivered an important message about academic realism and appropriate goal setting. That's when I stood up from my seat in the graduating class section. I walked calmly toward the podium, carrying my purse and the Harvard acceptance letter I had printed 3 days earlier. "Excuse me, Professor Davis," I said as I approached the microphone. "I believe you were referring to me in your speech about students who aren't smart enough for elite law schools." Professor Davis looked surprised and somewhat annoyed that I was interrupting the ceremony, but she didn't try to stop me from speaking. "Since you've made public claims about my intellectual capabilities and law school qualifications, I think it's appropriate to share some recent news with everyone here." I opened my purse and pulled out the Harvard Law School acceptance letter. "This morning, I received final confirmation of my admission to Harvard Law School for this fall," I announced to the amphitheater. Gasps rippled through the audience as 400 people processed the revelation that contradicted everything Professor Davis had just said about my qualifications. "I'd like to read a portion of the acceptance letter," I continued, unfolding the document. "Your application demonstrated exceptional analytical ability and academic promise. We look forward to welcoming you to Harvard Law School," I read aloud. The amphitheater erupted in applause and cheers from my fellow graduates, their families, and even some faculty members who were shocked by the turn of events. Professor Davis's face had gone completely white as she stood frozen beside the podium. "Professor Davis, you spent an entire semester telling me that I wasn't intellectually qualified for elite legal education," I said, looking directly at her. "You refused to write recommendation letters for top law schools because you believed I lacked the analytical sophistication they required," I continued. "Harvard Law School's admissions committee apparently disagreed with your assessment of my capabilities," I concluded, holding up the acceptance letter for everyone to see. Crowds' applause became even louder as students and families celebrated my vindication against Professor Davis's public criticism. I returned to my seat while Professor Davis stood motionless at the podium, apparently unable to process that her evaluation of my intellectual abilities had been so completely wrong. The graduation ceremony continued with diploma presentations, but the energy had fundamentally changed. Instead of Professor Davis's message about realistic expectations dominating the event, my Harvard acceptance had become the defining moment of the graduation. For the rest of the ceremony, classmates and their families approached me to congratulate me on my law school admission and express their amazement at the dramatic contradiction of Professor Davis's speech. "Sophia, I can't believe Professor Davis said those things about you right before you announced Harvard," one classmate said. "That was incredible. Your acceptance letter completely destroyed her credibility," another graduate observed. "How could she be so wrong about your qualifications?" My parents were mortified by Professor Davis's public attack but proud of my response and thrilled about the Harvard admission. "Sophia, we're so sorry that the professor said those things about you," my mother said after the ceremony. "But we're incredibly proud of how you handled the situation and your acceptance to Harvard." The aftermath of the graduation speech created lasting changes in how Professor Davis was perceived by students, faculty, and the university administration. Word of the incident spread quickly throughout the Riverside University community, seriously damaging Professor Davis's reputation as an educator and evaluator of student potential. "I can't believe Professor Davis was so wrong about Sophia's capabilities," other faculty members commented. Using graduation to publicly attack a student's qualifications was completely inappropriate. Several current students mentioned that the incident had made them question Professor Davis's judgment about their own academic potential and career prospects. If she was so wrong about Sophia's qualifications for Harvard, how can we trust her assessment of our capabilities? One student asked during course evaluations. The university administration received multiple complaints about Professor Davis's graduation speech, particularly the inappropriateness of using a public ceremony to attack individual students. Faculty speeches should inspire and celebrate graduating students, the dean said in a private meeting with Professor Davis. Using the platform to criticize specific students' academic goals was completely unacceptable. Professor Davis never apologized for her speech or acknowledged that her assessment of my intellectual capabilities had been completely wrong. Instead, she seemed to avoid situations where she might encounter me or be asked about her predictions regarding my law school prospects. The most telling response came when Professor Davis was asked by a local newspaper reporter about the graduation incident and my Harvard acceptance. Sometimes students exceed expectations through hard work and favorable circumstances, Professor Davis said dismissively. Law school admissions can be unpredictable. Her inability to acknowledge that she had been fundamentally wrong about my analytical abilities showed that she still couldn't accept the extent of her misjudgment. 3 months later, I'm preparing to start my first year at Harvard Law School with excitement and confidence about my future in legal education. The experience with Professor Davis taught me valuable lessons about academic confidence, professional authority, and the importance of trusting my own assessment of my capabilities. First, educators who constantly discourage students from pursuing ambitious goals may be motivated by their own limitations rather than accurate evaluations of student potential. Second, professional authority doesn't guarantee accurate judgment, and teachers can be wrong about students' capabilities even when they speak with confidence about intellectual limitations. Third, objective measures like standardized test scores and admissions decisions often provide more reliable assessments of academic potential than individual professors' subjective opinions. Most importantly, the experience reinforced that persistence and self-confidence are crucial when pursuing ambitious academic goals, especially when facing discouragement from authority figures. Today, I'm grateful for the Harvard opportunity and confident in my ability to succeed in legal education despite Professor Davis's predictions about my intellectual limitations. The graduation incident has become something of a legend at Riverside University about the dangers of underestimating students and the importance of supporting rather than discouraging ambitious academic goals. If you've experienced teachers or professors who told you to lower your expectations or questioned your intellectual capabilities, know that their assessments may reflect their own biases rather than your actual potential. Trust objective measures of your abilities, seek multiple perspectives on your academic prospects, and don't let one authority figure's opinion limit your aspirations. Thank you for listening to my story of graduation vindication and the acceptance letter that proved teachers can be wrong about students' potential. Sometimes the best response to people who say you're not smart enough is documentation that proves exactly how intelligent you really are.